The last few days, we've been training our 4-year-old son to not suck and soothe using his fingers. He's done it since he was a baby, and it really helped us when he was young. He slept so well as a baby, but now we're starting to have issues. It's messing up his teeth and things like this. So we got this special finger guard to keep him from sucking on his fingers, because the guard goes around the fingers. He can still move his fingers generally fine, but it stops the suction from happening. And so we've been dealing with that, and some later nights and things like this. He's wanted to crawl into bed to sleep in the middle of the night and such. But what's really funny through this is that there's been a couple of times where he'll wake me up in the morning and he'll say, "Dad, can we play Go?" And my reaction is always like, what? He remembers that he's played Go before, because I've shown him the board. I've brought it out. I brought out like a 9x9 board, and we'll show him the black stones, the white stones, and he can go as far as knowing how to take turns and putting stones on the intersections. And I can get about 3 or 4 or 5 stones deep with him, and then he invariably gets distracted and does something else. But yesterday morning, he says, "Dad, can we play Go?" And I say, I'm still waking up, and I go, "Sure." So I open up my closet and I get out the board, and, we put some black stones and some white stones down on the bed, and, we tried to play. Again, it was just for literally a couple of minutes before we got started with our day, but it was cool to see that he remembered the game. Honestly, it makes me wonder how the heck some of these child Go prodigies are becoming Don level players at the age of like 8 or 9. That it just blows my mind. I don't think my son is in that category, but nonetheless, it was a sweet thing to see. So with that, let's kick things off. This is All Things Go. We're now going to listen to my conversation with none other than Chris Garlock, who has very much been a fixture of the American Go community for many years. We got to talk about his early years with the game, broadcasting AlphaGo, and how to contextualize Go in American culture. First of all, Chris, I just want to introduce you. So you're Chris Garlock. You're the managing editor of the American Go e-journal and vice president of communications for the American Go Association. And this is actually interesting to learn that the e-journal is the most widely read English language Go publication in the world. You coordinate the online and broadcast coverage of Go tournaments and events. You've actually helped pioneer electronic and broadcast Go coverage, which is really cool. You've done live broadcasts of top games with real-time commentary from venues around the world. And you are an amateur 3-dan Go player yourself. Where did your Go journey begin? What about the game initially got you hooked?
Back in the 60s, when I was a kid, my dad was very interested in other cultures, and he discovered the game. And unfortunately, I didn't start playing when I was 6, because I'd be a lot stronger than 3-dan at this point. But I was fascinated. So that was my first exposure. I just have these sort of very childlike memories of, sort of peeping over the board and seeing these mysterious patterns play out. And, it just kind of looked cool. Didn't learn the rules, but, it was there. And so in 1985, when my son Benjamin was born, I was off or semi-off for a little while, and decided that was something that I would get into at that point. And I was in Philly at the time. And so in the back of, one of the few Go books that existed in 85, they had a listing of different Go clubs, and the Philly Go Club was listed. And it turned out it was being run by a guy who's now one of my best friends, Phil Strauss, who wound up serving as president of the Go Association later on, but he was running the Philadelphia Go Club in his kitchen. Phil was really my first official Go teacher, and there was a group of us at that Go Club. We formed a thing called the Break 10Q Club. And at the time, the only way you could do that was by, going to club, and, there's a few books in English, and, there's a few teachers. But I mean, when I think of the resource, somebody getting into Go now, from the AI to the tons of books to the videos,
right,
to apparently now podcasts, which I have to tell you, I was thinking for a while, because as you know, and I'm sure we'll get into it, I do podcasts and I do radio, and
right.
I was thinking thinking about doing a podcast on Go, and I can never quite figure out, it's such a visual game. So kudos to you for taking this on, man. My hat's off to you, because that's one place I just haven't gone.
I appreciate that. That's a really cool backstory. Now, how did your dad first get into it? Do you have any sense for how he got into Go when you were back in the 60s and seeing what he was doing?
He came to it he was very interested in, he studied literature and philosophy at Columbia. And so through that, I think he got into, remember, this is the 60s. And so there's a lot of people, folks who are interested in, Zen and Buddhism and Chinese philosophy. And so it really came into it through the, and then he had a friend at school, a guy named Don Hollick, who was a real student of Chinese literature. Mm-hmm. So I think he came into it through sort of literature and philosophy. And, it was one of those things where, they heard about this game and they had to go down to Chinatown and find, some $10 Go board, in some Chinese grocery.
Sure.
Which is probably where I got my first, I think I bought my first Go board at like a Chinese grocery in San Francisco or something like that, if I remember correctly. Yeah.
Back to your story. So you're talking about how you first got into it, and then sort of in the mid 80s when your son Ben was born, that really started growing from there in Philadelphia and connecting with Phil Strauss. How did that then lead to an eventual connection and getting more into like the Go community?
Well, I think I was very lucky in terms of, happening to live in Philadelphia where, A, there was a Go club, and B, it was a good Go club. Phil was a good organizer. It was, it had a few strong players, had a bunch of us that were around, the same strength, so we could really help each other out. But then the other thing that I really got lucky was in August of 85, that's when Benjamin was born. So it was the summer of 85 that I got into it. And then in 86, some of the folks from the Philadelphia Go club were going to, this thing called the US Go Congress. So I just thought that was what you did. It didn't really occur to me that it was really that special thing. I was like, you go to the Go Club and then you go to the Go Congress. So,
right.
And I didn't realize that it had only really just started out. I think it was only the second one. I think it was in Massachusetts, if I'm remembering correctly.
Oh, wow.
And so I was really fortunate in that right away, you go to the Go Club, you go to the Go Congress, and right away, immediately you can pretty much go anywhere in this country. And there's going to be, I was in, when Lisa and I did one of our long walks in England last year, I folks knew, I was doing fundraising for the American Go Federation. So it was out there on Facebook. And some of the folks in England were like, oh, you're coming. And they knew what the route was that I was taking, because it was walking the Thames River. And so they're like, oh, okay, you're going to be going through Oxford, stop in and see the Oxford Go Club, which I did. And we had dinner together, and it was great, and I didn't know these particular people. They were complete strangers, but they weren't, because they're Go players. So they, you're accepted, and we play the same game.
Maybe transitioning for a second to perhaps what you're most famous for, I would venture a guess, because it's really how I first came in contact with you as a relative newcomer to the game, is when you did the live broadcasting and commentary for the 2016 games between Lee Sedol and then DeepMind's AI program, AlphaGo. What was that like? I mean, to be part of that moment in history, not only from a Go perspective, but also just a broader sense with AI, because obviously we all know AI has really blown up in recent history in large part because of some of those moments. So tell us a little bit about that.
First of all, it was incredibly historic, obviously. I remember I actually had a conflict with a major event at work. I was working at the local AFL-CIO, and we had our big annual event, which I have a big role in. And I remember I went to my boss and I said, I got to go do this thing. And they were not real happy about it, because they're like,
Wow.
You have a key role in this. I'm like, I know I do, but actually somebody else can do that. But doing this thing for Go, nobody else can do, because I work with Michael Redmond, and Michael and I, when they asked Michael who he wanted to work with him, he was like, oh yeah, you got to get Chris, and so
wow.
We have a relationship. We knew how, even though this thing had not really been done and we didn't know what was going to happen with the AI, I was like, I have to do this. I don't know what's going to happen, but I was like, if you need me to just move on, I'll do that. And they were fine with it. It all worked out fine. So it was incredibly historic. It was kind of mind blowing because all of a sudden this game, which frankly, it's been really big, obviously in Japan, really big in Korea, really big in China. But despite the heroic efforts of, several generations of Go enthusiasts in this country, it's just never taken off. I've been membership secretary for the American Go Association. I did a lot of work on this. And, let's be honest, Go is not an easy game. It's very easy to learn.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an easy game. And so, people get into it and, we had incredible turnover at the Go Association. I mean, thousands of people would join and then they'd drop out after 6 months or a year because, they'd start playing and they'd realize, this game, which seems so easy, is actually quite hard and frustrating. And so in this country, we like things to be easy, It's one of the reasons pickleball is so popular. I literally, I could take you out and I could teach you to play in 5 minutes and you'd be good in 10 minutes and it's a lot of fun. And that's why people stick with it. And that's why it's the fastest growing sport. It's one of the reasons, by the way, tennis is a lot like Go. It takes months to get any good at all at tennis.
Interesting.
And most people just don't have the patience for it. You got to spend a lot of time. You got to spend money. People, Americans, we want stuff fast. I'm sorry, it's just the way it is. So actually, it's funny. At one point, when we were trying to figure out, they were going to give me a bunch of money at the AGA to promote Go, and I was like, "Yeah, here's my slogan: Go. It's too hard for you." I figured, we might as well be upfront about it.
Sure. It's so interesting though you say that, Chris, because that difficulty is also what draws in the people who do get into the game long term. And yet at the same time, the very nature of the game might also stop it from further spread. Is that fair?
No, I think you've got it exactly. I mean, and that was why my tongue was only partly in cheek when I suggested that slogan, because my point is, look, I've been playing this game for, almost 40 years now.
Sure.
And, I know the kind of folks who are attracted to it, these people who like a challenge. I mean, I'm not sixth on for a reason because, most of the people who are top players, they're really good at problem solving and puzzles and stuff like that. Most folks can get to Shodan if you put enough work in, you can get to Shodan. But getting from Shodan to 3Dan, that takes a lot more work. I read a couple levels above that. It made me a good game recorder because I could see what was going to happen. But strategically, I'm probably still, my strategy is probably still a couple levels below that. So we say, 5 minutes to learn, a lifetime to master. And
right.
That is okay. But going back to the Lee Sedol, AI, all of a sudden we were going to have this global audience for what is an obscure game, in my home country. And, trying to figure out, and Michael and I spent a lot of time, ahead of time. And then we would go for these long walks every day, just talking over our plans. We have people who know the game really, really well, and I'd get these notes from folks, because I was always doing really, really simple stuff because most of the people watching had never seen this game before or had only a very rudimentary idea of what was going on. Wow. So we had to pitch the game to both the folks who were coming in and just didn't know anything about it, because that was really Michael's job. Was, all right, Michael, release the Kraken and go down the rabbit hole on the, go real deep on the, the Joseki's in the corner, go for it. And then I'd have to pull them back, explain some of these terms. What's the simple thing here? What's the count? Then the two of us were completely out of our depth when it came to what the hell this AI was doing. We figured Google wouldn't do this unless they had a pretty good idea that it was going to work. But we also know how this stuff can go. And we would see the team, the AlphaGo team at breakfast in the morning, and we'd go over there and try and get information. Those guys were like CIA, man. They didn't tell us nothing. I mean, partly they just had like a code of silence, but also
they're like, why are these Americans over here? Yeah, okay.
Well, they knew we were doing the broadcast. And so, and eventually we did because we were always trying to get them to come on and, talk to us. And eventually they did. And we tried to get into the room. We really wanted to get into the room to see some of the stuff that, of course, we can all see now. We wanted to see the percentages. We wanted to see all of the, we really wanted to look under the hood. And one of the things that a lot of folks didn't necessarily know was that, we're doing these commentaries for hours and hours. I mean, it was just physically exhausting. And mentally exhausting because, we're in front of the cameras. I mean, trying to get bathroom breaks, and we're trying to keep those. We're both into physical fitness, and that was a lot of it. And it really gives you an appreciation for being a top level Go player, man, because to have that kind of focus for that long, we got a taste of it doing that broadcast. And then we're trying to figure out these moves by this AI, which were just crazy. I mean, seriously, it's like, what the hell is going on here? Sometimes they just didn't. I mean, now, of course, we have a much better sense. I mean, Michael and I have done so many of the commentaries.
Yes.
I would argue Michael's one of the people who's done just the most deep dive into how the AI works. And then, it was, we were very clearly defined. Michael's a deep dive. I'm the surface guy. I'm the sort of the relatable guy. It was so funny because someone said, but God, that guy, Garlock is dumb. And I'm like, well, that's kind of my job, Whether Michael and I have we're almost exactly the same age. And even though we have, very different backgrounds, we're both very accomplished in our particular fields. And so we have a huge amount of respect for each other. And we just genuinely like each other. I would interview him. I would go to cover international events. And, so it started out with me just interviewing him, getting to know him. He got to know me, and we just became friends. But we also just have a lot of respect. And one of the things that I encouraged him was to, I know he loves Go history. And I know the fans out there, some of you are like us, you love the Go history. Some of you could give two shits about it. I mean, I know, it's like, enough with the history stuff. Let's get back to the game. But I'm sorry, first of all, you need to know the history. It's a great history. It is the oldest continually played game in the world. And so you're going to get history. And also, that's part of who Michael is. And Michael actually does have a sense of humor. A lot of people don't know that, but he actually is very dry. And so a lot of times I'd just be trying to get him to kind of laugh or something, which is, if I could get him to crack a smile or something, I do that though. When we're doing commentaries or when I'm doing, for other folks, there's a lot of these, even these top amateur players, same thing. You do not get to be a top Go player without just being deadly serious. Like in tennis, they train you from an early age on how to deal with the media, how to talk to the media, how to be approachable, right? Mm-hmm. They don't do that in Go. And we don't trash talk. It's a whole different kind of an ethos. And so that's just a very different kind of thing.
How would you say your role as sort of head of communications for the American Go Association, how has that benefited your day job as a labor union advocate, or vice versa? How has your labor union work really benefited things you do as a communicator of Go?
Since I was a kid, I've really been interested in communications. And I remember when somebody, probably my grandparents, gave me a little printing press with little, rubber, little rubber things you put together. And I had a little newsletter. It was sort of the equivalent of, there's a kid in the neighborhood now that has a little email newsletter. Well, it was that, except, we actually, little kid mimeograph, right? And I, just this idea, but just that I can make my own version of that and then take it around and then, and communicate with a bunch of people. That seemed like a cool thing. So my entire career has been about communication. And so everything that I do always winds up trying to figure out, how can we communicate? Because if we can communicate, then we can build this community. More people will play Go, more people will play tennis, more people will organize unions, So when I got into the Go community, got into the Go club and then was doing going to the Go Congress. And then there was a Go journal, which was a quarterly. But the problem with the quarterly was that it just wasn't, and this would have been in the mid to late 80s.
Okay.
And so email and the internet was just sort of getting going. It was very primitive, but there was email. It was pretty clunky, but there was email. You could do that. And so Actually, before that, I created a newsletter that was a very simple newsletter that would come out monthly that was just basically tournament reports. And people would actually like phone them into me, like call me on the phone and give
Oh,
me, and
wow.
you would call me up and tell me who won. And then we would do this newsletter and get it printed up and sent out. And then that became a email newsletter. Again, very, very primitive. And basically that became, as the internet developed, then we could do, more, nicer things. I remember, originally it was just text, and then eventually we could start doing, it was plain text, and then we could do
Wow.
formatting of text, and then it was big when we could do, I remember being at tournaments or at the Go Congress, I had a Palm Pilot, and I would produce the newsletter into this little Palm Pilot.
Oh my gosh.
Oh
I
my
remember
God.
them. Yeah,
Oh,
sure.
it was such a pain in the ass. You have
Oh my
no
God.
idea.
I
Trying.
cannot imagine that. Yeah, that
Yeah.
would be
Oh,
so difficult.
yeah. So you can imagine how thrilled I've been as, capitalism, thank God, has really bailed us out.
Wow. So it's interesting, right? Because you've seen just all the changes, to your point, that you've seen, right? And the ability to communicate anything, I mean, in your job, but particularly in Go because of, what we're discussing here. And when I looked at that biography on that second volume of your new AlphaGo to Zero book, which I certainly encourage others to read, that came out, I think, last year, you were, again, among the first to broadcast Go through sort of
Yep.
an audio visual format. So now you've done a lot of work on online streaming, on Twitch, those sorts of things. But what I wanted to ask you is, with the relative popularity, I would say, of online gaming platforms and Go streamers and content creators in recent times, what are your thoughts on these latest forms of broadcasting Go out to the world from a communication perspective? What do you see as the benefits? What do you see as some of the things that might be a good thing, but then are there some things that might be hurting or maybe holding it back?
I'm pretty pro communication. I mean, I don't. We certainly done Twitch stuff. Michael and I still kind of prefer broadcasts, that may be broadcast on Twitch. We're not really doing the stuff where, I've watched some of the stuff where people are playing and doing the commenting and responding, to the comments. And, we're a little old school for that. But I appreciate it. I came at it from a journalism background. And so I was like, this is competition. And so we should treat it like competition. There should be reports on it. And, I know, for example, the history of golf. I mean, back in probably the 40s or 50s, right? It was pretty primitive. It's hard to think of, when it's such a huge, zillion-dollar
Right.
business now. Or tennis just in in the last 20 years. I mean, there was no tennis channel. The majors would be on TV, and it was pretty, I wouldn't say boring, but it was small screen and you could barely see the balls. The tennis coverage that they have now with the analysis and the stats and the zooming cameras, you can watch some tournament in some little Romanian town or whatever. I mean, that was unthinkable. So to me, that was always my idea, was that Go it is played around the world. And so, I still think that, a Go channel with somebody with a deep, but you'd have to do the same kind of thing where you do make it more entertaining. And so I think a lot of the Twitch streamers, are sort of doing that, but you sort of need to marry that with the professional level. Like one of the great things, going back to the Lisa Doll AlphaGo match, Google, of course, being Google, brought in just as incredible. You've seen the film, but I mean, I was talking a lot with the documentary crew because that's as part of my business. And
Sure.
These guys have done Super Bowls. I mean, these people have done top level sporting events. Well, they actually did a lot of talking with us, just as they were trying to figure it out, also trying to figure out how do we do this. And it's one of the reasons that we were there was to provide that play by play, because otherwise, it's going on. So it's a lot of room for a lot of things to happen. But I was very interested when poker, got real popular.
Sure.
I spent a year just reading all these different books on games, and I watched a lot of online poker. Again, just from a professional, trying to think, okay, poker, why is poker so popular? Why were people, they did a really good job by showing people the hole cards, right? That's ingenious, right? Now you know something that the players don't know. That is very cool. So I think that that's one thing that when streamers are talking about what they're thinking about. Now, the trash talking, I'm not a big fan
Yeah,
of,
that's
but
unfortunate.
to me, that may be a generational thing. One of the things I've always liked about Go is the same thing I like about tennis. And it's largely true in pickleball as well, by the way, is that there's, this real ethos of respect and no trash talking. But I recognize that for some folks, that's something that they enjoy and they like. So tennis has Nick Kyrgios. Interestingly, though, he's really the only one, that nobody else really does that, because I think it's part of the ethos of tennis. And I like that. And I think I don't know that that's ever going to change and Go. I don't think it really, I just don't think it works.
So you don't think there'll be like a bad boy, bad girl, bad person personality? It just doesn't fit in with the cultural background?
I think that, there are. I mean, there are some, that they're there. There's something about the game itself. They're going through this with baseball right now. They're trying to figure out, how do you make baseball more popular with a modern audience, right? So they're trying to do some different things. But I mean, baseball is a pastoral game. If you change it too much, is it really still baseball, right? And so these are things that happen with every game when it becomes popular and they start televising it, right? And they realize at the end of the day, Go is two people sitting across from a board, in silence. I mean, what are you going to do with that?
Right. Well, I mean, it's interesting though, Chris, because, what you have done, and I think you and Michael have done really well, and what came through so clearly in the AlphaGo documentary, which for me was my watershed moment, as I think for a lot of people. There are pieces moving across the board. And as you learn more and more about the game and understand it more and more, there's so much change and subtlety and nuance when one stone is placed on that board. Potentially everything could be changing at that moment. But if you're the uninitiated, or if you're just too low in level of understanding, you have no idea, right? Versus you or I can go and watch a sport and you're generally going to understand what's going on. Whereas in commentating, which you've done for years and years, you're trying to get at that. Okay, Michael, help us understand what just happened here. What happened to these different groups? What's really great, Chris, is that you spent so much time in the community trying to think about how to bridge that gap. If there is that another moment, if it's the AlphaGo documentary or if it's something else, and there's a huge inflow, a wave of initial interest, how we try to retain some of it beyond, like you said, the 6-month period. What's your current line of thinking? If somebody said, Chris, what's the move, right? We're going to put a lot of resources behind you. What do you think is a single factor or a couple of factors that you think might start to bridge that gap?
Go has been around for thousands of years, and it's a great game. When I was membership secretary for the AGA, I say it as communications, VP. I try and communicate it, with the e-journal and certainly, through the stuff that Michael and I do, because we feel the same way about it, right? I don't feel any need to sell the game. It's very funny. Phil and I have been playing in public for years, and one of the reasons that we're a really good team is that, somebody would stop and say, oh, what's that game? And my response would always be, oh, you can find out about it's Go, and you can find out about it at usgo.org. Go check it out, right?
Sure.
Phil will actually teach people how to play the game of Go. I'm not saying either one of them is right. They're different approaches, right? But my thing is that I know that most people are going to wash out. They're not going to stick with it. And so, the game is here and we are here. The Go Association is here. The Go Associations in countries around the world. It's fascinating. It's in places like India where it's not that popular. They've had Go Congresses in Mexico, where it's not that popular, but they're working on it. So the game is a good game. It's a simple game. It's been the same game for thousands of years. It must be something about it, right? It took the computers a long time, not as long as we thought it would, but it took them a long time to crack it. And once they cracked Go, by the way, it turned out to be the key to cracking a whole lot of other stuff. So, I hate to say we told you so, but, we did. So I'm not somebody who feels like we have to sell the game of Go. I'm like, I'm more interested in, and this is something that Michael and I talk a lot about, every game tells a story. Question is, what is the story? And the favorite commentaries that Michael and I have done is trying to figure out what is that story. That's the interesting thing about commenting it. And when we decided to do books about it, I said, I was not interested in just doing books that were just commentaries on the games. To me, anybody could do those. We could probably do them better, but anybody could do those because you can look at the moves and you can analyze them. That wasn't interesting to me. I was like, I wanted to have the videos. We had these great videos that we did that were professionally produced. We had the long ones. We also, I don't know if you've taken a look at them, but the 15-minute ones, because after each game, after we'd done these hours long commentaries, we would then go and we would do these short commentaries because that's what we're good at. And we're like, we need to have something for people, who are not going to go, I don't know how many times the longer ones have been watched, but the shorter ones, I was really, really proud of the short ones because that's where we're taking this, 10-volume story and boiling it down to a short story that you can, read in 3 to 5 minutes. That was where our skill, the things that made Michael and me special, that's where it really came down. We had to know what that story was and how to tell that story. What are the key points of the game to tell that story? So we wanted to tell some of the history. We wanted to have the videos embedded. And we had to do some technological things working with our publisher that had not been done before. I said, I want to create, and that's why it took us a little bit longer. I said, you can't really just do a print book for these games. That doesn't really, work for us. So we had to basically invent some things, and it's a whole other podcast. But you should interview Anders Kirov because he really
Go Books and Smart Go. Yeah, that's been huge.
Gosh.
And that's what I've used personally. So that great point, because that has been so helpful versus just reading 1, 2, 3, 4 on a visual. Right? It's just my brain doesn't work that way.
Well, that was actually my argument, because I'm a guy that came up with, when that was the only way, where you had books with printed diagrams, 1 through 50, or God help us, 1 through 200, and you're trying to find
I can't track anything.
Oh my God. I mean, you really had to be seriously committed. And I was like, I'm not doing that anymore. We have tools now. How do we embed these tools? And Andrew's like, I don't know, dude. And I was like, let's figure it out. And I'm really, really proud of those books. And in volume 2, we're going to break it into these different, because there are definitely 4 different versions, and we can't just do it all in one. We have to really do it. So that's a very long answer to your question. I'm sorry about that.
It's very helpful, Chris, and I appreciate it, because I think it goes back to this point of like, what's the goal? I can certainly appreciate people that want to make it more popular, and this is something that I personally struggle with. I say to myself, wow, this game is so fascinating, and I think it's going to be with me for the rest of my life. And the things that I love about it are also sometimes the things that are very frustrating about it, right? There is nobody in my physical life, like when I'm going to work, when I'm talking to people, there's nobody that knows about it. And if somebody knows about it, it's because I've told them about it or I've introduced it to them. And one thing that you told me about when you said, hey, I'm not particularly keen on selling the game, there's also something that comes with showing that energy of, hey, I know why I like it. I know why it has meaning to me. And people might just put that fact pattern together. And if they happen to be a type of person that says, wow, Chris might be onto something, I want to check that out, they might pick up that energy from you. So I think there's a lot to say, because I've heard this from other, Go teachers that say, you got to be careful, right? You can't come on too strong with anything, right? If you go over and say, hey, this is tennis and this is why it's the best, it might rub people the wrong way. So I actually really appreciate that answer.
Well, and also what tends to happen, and I've seen this, over and over again, is that people put a lot of energy, into teaching at a Go club or whatever, right? And then people quit. Because it just happens. It just happens over and over again, right? And then you're like, well, damn, I just spent 6 months, teaching this person, and then they don't show up at club anymore, right? And you feel like you wasted your time. And so to me, the thing is, the game is here, and I support clubs. I've done a lot, and I've been actually working. I worked with a number of presidents now, and I've always told them. In fact, when they wanted to give me money to publicize, Go, I was like, no, let's put that money into the clubs. The clubs are where the action is at, right? What I want is that when you or your friends or whoever gets into Go, I want there to be a local club for you to go to, And now we're putting money into the streamers. And that was the other thing was, as I said, let's put money into the streamers. It's
Sure.
it's a little experiment that we're doing, but I think it's going to work out. But I think some of these people are doing really good work. Some of it I'm not crazy about, but I don't care. If you got people watching you, let's give them some money. Let's see how this goes. So when you get into it, it's there. But I've seen this in tennis as well. I can't tell you how many guys I've seen that'll start playing in their 40s. And I'm like, yeah, I played was in high school. I played was in college. And, I got busy with work. I got married. I had kids. Now I've got a little bit more time. Kids are, I don't have to be babysitting
Empty
all the
nester,
time.
sure.
And so they come back to the game, usually in their 40s. They feel like, oh, I wish I hadn't stopped playing. I'm like, the game is still here, man. That's why I tell people, go to usgo.org. Go to your Go club, get some of these books or whatever, but at the same time, I will always play a game of Go with somebody. I will always, I was just the other night, I was playing pickleball, and this woman I was playing with, she said, you seem like you know some stuff. And she asked me some tips, and we did like a little 15-minute lesson, so I will invest some time in that. But at the same time, you just got to show up. That's the main thing. You got to show up.
For you personally, in your sort of role in this, because there's a lot of incredible experience and things that you're doing regularly in the Go community, where do you derive most of your kind of meaning and fulfillment? Is it the communication aspect? What is it?
I mean, I've been doing it a while now. I mean, I'm kind of in a transition period because, with the streaming, for example, and the Twitch and so forth, Michael and I still do stuff. And Michael, started during the pandemic, started his own YouTube channel, which I really encouraged him to do because frankly, he needed, his source of funding was cut off. Everybody, couldn't play. And so that's been going really, really, we did a lot of promotion for that and helped him with that. And so I've been trying to really, like at Go Congresses, there's people who are much more technically proficient than I am. And so I've been, you show up and you've got some skills and you've got some ideas. I'm like, okay, Travis, give it a try, because it's kind of hard to screw up. You know what I'm saying? I mean, I'm not real worried about that. I'm like, sometimes we do stuff and it doesn't work. And sometimes I remember at one Congress, this was, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 years ago. And we just started putting people who were like, oh, I've never done commentary. I'm only 8Q. I'm like, well, there's a lot of 8Qs out there.
Sure.
And frankly, our first idea was to get all the pros and the really top players playing, but nobody could understand what they were talking about, or most of what they were talking about, right? So we started putting 8Qs out there, 10Qs out there. I remember putting some kids out there who were, because they've grown up digitally, right? They were very comfortable on camera. They were entertaining as hell. And people were like, what are you doing putting kids on there? I was like, I don't know. It looks like,
Let's give it a shot, right? Let's see what happens. Let's mix things up. I really appreciate that. And that's sort of the idea here, right? Because I'm certainly not the expert, right? And I think hearing from experiences of people like you, Chris, and just all the things that you've seen and where you think it might go, it's just a really fascinating story. So I do want to just say thank you again. This has been an incredible, insightful period of time. So thank you. And I appreciate it.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Anytime and any way that I can be helpful to you, I will be happy to do that.
When I was in college, I actually majored in religion, and I got to it because I wasn't particularly interested in anything else. I was decent at math, but there wasn't a clear path of what I wanted to do. And so studying religion was really fascinating to me because it showed so much about how people think and see and view the world. I wasn't always necessarily so interested in what the religion was or what those beliefs were, more about that interplay between religions or religion then into society. And Go has been very interesting to me because of the puzzle and intricacy of it as a puzzle, but also the fact that it's impossible not to draw parallels from Go and other areas of life. And so I was drawn to the book by William Cobb, who is a professor emeritus from the College of William and Mary, who had sort of a nice compilation of different pieces that he's written for the American Go Association over time and other journals and publications. He has a really nice viewpoint around the game of Go and connecting it to Buddhist philosophy. And so I was naturally drawn to it given my background. And there were some great points and quotes that I wanted to bring up about how Go can connect us to meaningful life concepts and principles that may or may not suit you. I think some of them certainly suit me. In learning about the history of Go, it seemed that there is a lot of connection to the concepts of war, as I've talked to in previous episodes, and as we've seen with samurai in Japan and things like this. And it's nice to see another area that it could also be connected to around something that is not as violent. Earlier in my life, yoga was a big focus. And so I think, again, a connection there. So inside the book, William Cobb has an article that was published back in the Eastern Buddhist in, I believe, in 1997. The article is titled The Game of Go, An Unexpected Path to Enlightenment. And what it does is it gives an overview of the key issues that he dealt with in a lot of articles written for the American Go Journal since 1994. But he makes the argument that Go encapsulates the key principles of Buddhism really quite well. The first quote that really stood out to me on this concept was as follows. It says, "For the Go player, discovering how fascinating and enjoyable it is to dwell in such an open-ended world can be a revelation. You learn to revel in the creative possibilities that result from the relative absence of defined powers and fixed structures, rather than being frustrated or distressed by the fact that this means there are no final answers regarding what constitutes good play." It is unfortunate that we all get frustrated or distressed, as William Cobb says, about not having that final answer on good play. The fact that it is a game that is so open-ended, it scares us in the beginning. This is part of why it's so challenging to get into the game beyond learning the rules and the basics, is that there is just such a vast ocean of possibilities at the beginning of the game, particularly on a 19 by 19 board. But what you learn over time, and what I've learned over time, is that freedom starts to become really exciting and really interesting and fun if you have the right mindset. The next part I wanted to talk about is that William Cobb brings in the concepts of impermanence and interconnectedness, which are apparently key principles with Buddhism, and connects them to Go by saying, "These two principles are also fundamental to the game of Go, and the most obvious manifestation of interconnectedness in Go is the way groups of stones develop during play." And so he goes on to talk about how it will signal the shift in importance and significance of different groups as the game goes on. From a interconnectedness perspective, those stones are constantly changing, again, their importance. But then also from an impermanence perspective, at one moment in the game, those stones could be critical. They could be cutting stones between groups, or they could be threatening something that's happening on the board. And then all of a sudden something happens nearby. Let's say there's a big framework or moyo being formed, or something is captured, or a group it becomes weak, and all of a sudden that stone is not important anymore. Or you can sacrifice a group because there's something bigger happening on other parts of the board. So those felt like pretty straightforward connections to the game. It did really pique my interest about this concept of interconnectedness, because when we think about Western culture and we think about individuals, there's a lot of emphasis placed on individuality. And Buddhism very much eschews that. And this concept of interconnectedness really goes back to it, because it talks about the fact that you are really only something in the sense that you are connected or relating to other things. And so on the Go board, a stone is only as important as it is in relationship to other parts of the board, almost like an electromagnetic field. If that stone is too close to its nearby stones, it's perceived as overconcentrated. It's not going to help you as much. But if that stone is too far away from its other stones or fellow friendly stones, it could be at risk of being separated if it's under attack. And here William Cobb says in the article, he says, "The significance of the vulnerability of the stones to the tides of fortune accustoms the player to the reality of impermanence. And again, this is found not to be a dreadful situation, but one that greatly enriches the experience of playing. This also emphasizes a concept where when you're a newer player or a novice player, it's really, really challenging to let go of a certain line of attack or a certain strategy. If I am planning to make sure that certain stones on the board are strong and stay alive, but then they come under threat, but there might actually be some other opportunity on the board where I can sacrifice those stones, it's very challenging for me to give up those stones and let them be impermanent. Whereas for more advanced players, I think that's actually a much easier thing. It's a concept where more skilled players or players that understand the game better are more willing and able to make those trades. Something that my Go teacher keeps reiterating to me is that the game is all about trade-offs. If your opponent is taking influence or territory on this part of the board, you need to be asking yourself, what are you getting in return? And if you're not getting anything, there's a problem. There was something that might not have been played as well as it could have been. Next up, this concept of no self comes up, and the way Professor Cobb phrases it, he sets up the argument that because there is no self in Buddhism and there is a similar essence or there's a similar idea in Go, it cannot be good to win and it can't be bad to lose, which is a very interesting concept. Most games you play, the purpose is to win. Others who know the game very well or who have studied the game a lot have mentioned the fact that if you are playing somebody of equal rank or equal ability, you will lose half the games and you'll win half the games. So if that's the case and the goal is not just to win, certainly you want to strive to win as you would in any game, it's also showing that losing is a very important part of the game. And Professor Cobb talks about how it's ironic that, like Go, martial arts has become very famous or popular in the West because of the individual talents of people. And yet martial arts is also supposed to emphasize this concept of no self, that it's not really about the individual person. It's about connecting back to a relationship to the overall order of things or the universe or whatever you want to call it. I'm only a function of my relationship to others is sort of how it's described here. And I know that I hear from my teacher, but also others, that you could consider it better to lose in your games of Go than winning because you actually will learn more if that's what your goal is. I think, again, in our culture in the West, we're very much focused on winning being the most important thing, but learning and improving is incredibly enjoyable too. And if we want to learn and do better, that often means losing the game. And it often means playing more skilled players. There's constantly this battle between, okay, I want to play better players because then it will really lay bare my weaknesses in my game. But the other side to that is there is morale. And there's the fact that if we just lose and lose and lose and lose, there comes a point where you're trying to understand if you're even enjoying things. And that's a valid point, and there's a balance to strike there. It's also true that losses stick in our head more. And so if you want to learn, lose that game, because if you then are able to review it with somebody that really has a bit more knowledge on that and can help you identify what mistakes you made, it's going to really stick in your head because of that emotional. Sometimes it is gut-wrenching to lose, or you thought you were winning and it changed. It's going to really stick with you. And in the kind of work I do, there's something in behavioral finance called the prospect theory, which says that we hate losses more than we love wins, particularly with investments. And this is true, I think, in games as well. And so if you win a game, there are certainly things and mistakes that we make playing Go that we can learn, but it's unlikely or it's less likely that we're going to learn from them quite as strongly because we don't have as much of an emotional connection compared to when we lose and there are mistakes that we made there. There needs to be a trick that we need to play on ourselves, which is really just tell yourself, like, losing is good. Losing is good. Like, I need to lose. And if you can just sort of hang in there and stick with it, and I think we all need support from others in the community and friends, that will really help you improve. And I know I find a lot of support from that from my teacher. Professor Cobb then talks about the handicapping system in Go and how that can be very much an antidote to this concept of self, where self is saying, I need to win, I'm an individual, and I need to do something that's going to get me what I need. Because in Buddhism, there isn't as much that focus. It's, oh, there is no me. I'm really only something in relationship to other things, people, whatever it might be. And so Professor Cobb talks about how you should be losing half your games if you're on a similar level. And he says here, quote, in fact, many players often say that it's better to lose than to win, because when you lose, it is usually obvious that you overlooked some sort of possibility and you can learn from that. While if you win, it is usually because the other player made an obvious mistake. I'm not sure if I completely agree with that. I think sometimes you can make obvious mistakes on both sides of winning and losing. He then says, it is often a matter of years of play between advances in your level of play, and the level of most players ceases to increase after a time. Thus, the character of the game encourages players to abandon attachment to getting stronger, as well as to winning, and to focus instead on enjoying the game at the level they are able to play. And this is key because it goes back to the fact that we all want to improve, but we're all going to have natural ceilings that we're going to hit depending on when we started playing, depending on our natural abilities. Something that has come up over and over as I've talked to others in the Go community, particularly teachers, is that they find that their students get pretty bummed out when they feel like they're not improving, which is a completely universal thing. We all feel that way. But I've also heard that because Go is so intricate and there's so many things that can be happening on the board anyways, that you could theoretically enjoy the game and have many different things happen, even if you're not improving. And I think that's something that I personally hold on to because I'm at a particular age, I'm in my late 30s, where I think I will have a lot of room to improve because I haven't played the game perhaps as much as I might be able to later in life. At the same time, I know cognitively I'm going to be changing. And so taking those things into account is important. Professor Cobb talks about the fact that you should adjust to the handicap so that you are in that sort of 50-50 state. But it's interesting how in competitive Go or professional Go, the top player, Shinjin So, is at a much higher win-loss rate than much of his competition, which shows that he's pulling away or has pulled away quite a bit. And I guess playing other players that are a few ranks higher than you doesn't necessarily fall into line of what Professor Cobb is saying here and the Buddhist philosophy around sticking to that similar level. I do find that sometimes when you're at that similar level, there isn't as much, sometimes it's not as obvious what the mistakes were that you made. Sometimes they are, but because you might be similar in level, you might not see that. Then Professor Cobb in this article talks about the delight that is often shared equally when two players feel they have created a particularly elegant game. I think a lot of us can connect with this. You played a game and it really comes down to the wire and you feel like you're very close. You don't feel like there were obvious mistakes. And even if you lose by a little bit, and if you win by a little bit, it feels so good. It feels so gratifying. It really felt like it was a conversation where you didn't know where it was going to end up, but that you were both pushing each other. And that can be really fun. The converse side to that is that if there is too big of a difference in ability, maybe you didn't do the handicapping correctly, and then you play the game and it is incredibly lopsided, there's too big of a gap, maybe the weaker player just doesn't have some of those concepts down, it can be a big disappointment. I'm not sure how that factors into this whole concept that connects back to Buddhism. The article ends with some thoughts around playing Go and how it represents the Buddhist ideals of non-separateness and the concept of nirvana, where you are just sort of playing for the sake of playing. And he says, quote, "The stones play themselves. The players merely facilitate this process and allow it to occur." I can't say that I've ever been in that sort of Zen state where I'm just playing and not thinking. I feel like I'm constantly having to think because it's incredibly challenging for me. But it does feel like this could connect back to the concepts of intuition and building pattern pattern recognition and muscle memory from hours and hours and years of playing the game over time as we get better, and just playing a move because it felt right, because it felt like the shape was correct. And then, of course, there are those moments where you have to read things out. At the same token, this is also what makes the game really challenging. If you're a newcomer, you have absolutely no idea what to do after the first move. If it's on a smaller board, maybe you have some concept, but on the 19 by 19 board, it just gets really daunting. So it was a really nice article. I highly recommend it. It just hits some nice points home if you want to connect, go back to something like the Buddhist philosophy. Because what I'm finding over time is that Go becomes so interesting for a lot of us, particularly for me, because the basics of it and the logic that it follows leads to all this complexity that then starts to inform us about other areas of life, like religion, like Buddhism. And it can be very instructive in that way and help us think about how other parts of life function and work. And it can give us, I think, extra awareness. I certainly feel like I have more awareness, or I'm able to connect the dots a little bit more when I think about other processes in life. And religion is no different from that. As we end this episode, I want to ask you the question: where were you when the AI Lee Sedol set of matches happened? Were you playing at that time? Were you not playing and you learned about it through the AlphaGo documentary or something else? What was your reaction? Whether you have been playing for many years and were playing before the AI revolution, or whether you were playing after. Let me know, and thanks so much for listening.